Hi, thanks for joining. Wish you all a very, very happy new year and a prosperous 2024. I'm Kishor Gummaraju, the Chief Customer Officer at Tiger Analytics, and I welcome you to this webinar on transforming decision intelligence for enterprises, the next frontier with AI and GenAI. For discussing this topic, we've invited a very esteemed panel out here. And without much ado, I'll get into introducing them. I request them to introduce themselves. So, Shashank.
Hey, everybody. Hi, Kishor. First of all, thanks for inviting me and being a part of this exciting conversation and discussion. So I'm SHASHANK KADETOTAD. I work with Mars, specifically within the Mars Snacking Division and the ODDA group. So I'm the Global Director of Data Science with the ODDA team. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for joining, Shashank. SRIRAM.
Hello, everyone. I'm SRIRAM KRISHNAMURThy. I lead the machine learning practice at Tiger Analytics. And thanks, Kishor, for having me in the panel.
Excellent. And last but not least, Rowan. Rowan, you seem to be on mute.
I am so sorry. My name is Rowan Curran. I'm a senior analyst at Forrester Research. I'm super happy to be here. I cover a variety of topics, but today I'm covering AI machine learning platforms and generative AI to have this great discussion with everybody.
Fantastic. And thank you, everyone, for joining in. And the discussion today we are going to do is we're going to follow a certain structure. We'll first start with Rowan presenting us what he has done in Forrester and whatever research they've come up with and what they're seeing as trends in this space on generative AI in the enterprise and enterprise and decision intelligence. And thereafter, we'll get into a fireside chat. And this is going to be where we'll have SRIRAM, Shashank, and Rowan discuss on things that they're seeing, the opportunities, the challenges through real-world case studies, the patterns of adoption, upskilling of the team, establishing the team, and other best practices. Right. So without much ado, we'll get into the conversation itself. Rowan, over to you. You can present your screen. I'll stop sharing right here.
Great. Thank you so much. Just get my screen shared right now. All right. Well, thank you once again, everybody, for joining today. Thank you, everybody on the panel. Super excited for our discussion after this presentation. To kind of kick us off here, I'm just going to be talking a bit about generative AI in the enterprise and how it's come in to start affecting the decisions that we're making and how it's really starting to have a significant impact on enterprise growth and applications. So to kick us off here, I'll take a step back from the overall enterprise. So we've seen, the generative AI zeitgeist kind of take over the world in the past 13 months. And that's really because there's so many different applications of this technology in a variety of different domains, not just the enterprise, though that's where we'll focus today. So it's important as we're kind of talking about making decisions in the enterprise and thinking about how we're applying generative AI, that it's affecting our employees in their personal lives as well and at the broader societal level. And so we need to consider these things as we're building, deploying solutions and upskilling and bringing more of our stakeholders on board. So how did we get to this point? Well, I think we're all kind of aware that it was precipitated by the release of ChatGPT at the end of 2022. While this wasn't the first large language model to be released, it wasn't even, the first model of, that family of models to be released. But the package that actually wrapped up that overall model, that core large language model, is really what made the big difference. So it wasn't just a model that catalyzed the current explosion we have, it was the application experience that was provided around it. And what this has all led to is this moment that we're in now, which is a very unique and mutually complementary set of forces where we have executives and shareholders, as well as consumers and individual contributors and teams, all putting pressure on this wheel to drive generative AI acceleration forward. So to kind of bring this metaphor in a different direction, we really see, and we have seen at our clients, generative AI used as a fulcrum to lever the broader enterprise AI discussion from something that just sat in innovation teams, or maybe was a bit on the back burner if it wasn't coming out with very cool and shiny AI applications in years past. And the past 12 or 13 months, we've seen CIOs and other tech leaders be able to use generative AI excitement and the capabilities of generative AI to advance their budgets and their projects and win more executive and end user support for overall AI projects. And what this is leading to is enterprise AI being elevated to the level that it needs to be so that businesses can drive growth through differentiated strategies around AI itself. Now, when we're talking about AI and generative AI, it's important to remember that generative AI is not the whole story of AI overall. We need to also consider the entire other set of models and approaches to building inferences, which is, it's called a couple of different things, but I like to call it predictive AI. Others call it legacy AI or traditional AI, but I think predictive AI more effectively captures what these models do and how we use them. So predictive AI you can think of as any type of model that is typically used to point to a single piece of data or a very small subset of data to predict or identify a certain thing. And generative AI you can think of as kind of generating a whole data set, whether that be a set of text or an image or something along those lines. And while each of these is very powerful on their own, one of them typically oriented towards more structured data sets and more specific tasks, and the other oriented more towards generalized tasks, typically associated with unstructured data and language. It's really when they come together in applications that we can build the most effective experiences and then make the most useful decisions at our organizations. So to just delve into this very quickly for another moment, when we're thinking about predictive and generative AI can be thought of as things like propensity scores, customer intent, whether someone fits into a segment or not, as well as traditional decisioning like mathematical optimization. And then generative AI, like I said, is for generating whole data sets, whether that be a paragraph of text, some computer code, images or video, 3D shapes or audio. Now, generative AI can be applied in a lot of different ways. And so we're seeing a ton of different use cases and a ton of excitement around actually adopting them. And this has actually been one of the biggest, the fastest progresses from we see as folks who are just educating themselves about these types of technologies, as you see here, just learning more about it, all the way through to exploring, experimenting, and even expanding their implementation. So this is data from July of last year, where we surveyed about 275 tech leaders, and we saw that more than 50% were already in the experimentation and expansion stage. But even more interesting than that, when we went back and we resurveyed them a couple of months later, we noticed was they were getting more nuanced about how they were thinking about use cases as they got further along in their development and in their application of generative AI. And this is a very important point for everybody who's looking at building applications with this stuff. Most of the use cases that we're seeing in deployment today are internal enterprise-facing applications, not necessarily customer-facing applications, even though that is typically what drives a lot of the excitement and a lot of the enthusiasm around this space. So if we look at kind of the use cases that we see folks anticipating building over the next 12 months, we see that they're very heavily focused on empowering your employees, managing better knowledge, and doing things like improving software development and self-service for data and analytics. And things like enhancing customer-facing experiences are, still a lot of interest in that, but it's a bit lower on the list of use cases. Now, if we talk about kind of the common areas of use cases that we're seeing today, they would fall into 4 broad categories. The first one here is around writing and communication support. This also includes things like productivity tools and what you might think of as copy editing tools that are basically helping you to turn a few bullets into a nice, clean email to a customer, or maybe turn a few pieces of information into a quarterly report on a specific area of your business. And this is commonly used all across the enterprise, but very heavily used in specific areas like marketing and communication support, marketing and sales, and those types of areas where there needs to be a large volume of customized content generated at a high rate. Then we also have use cases around content summarization, transformation. These often fall behind or in the back of the house. They are not front-end use cases. So we have folks that are basically using large language models for summarization and data preparation on the back end. Then we also have a ton of folks who are using generative AI and large language models combined with adjacent technologies like vector databases to do knowledge retrieval and search in a much deeper, more contextual and more semantically relevant way for the retrieval of the information. And then we have a massive area of use around the space of Turing bots, which is how we refer to the use of large language models and generative AI broadly for the development of software applications. And today we typically see them around coding and testing. Now, acquiring generative AI can typically, take a couple of different paths at enterprises. We have folks that are, leveraging models directly, an open source model, bringing it behind their own firewall. Maybe they're doing some fine tuning with an instruction data set if they're very sophisticated, but typically they'll be using things like prompt engineering and the vector database to ground the information. Then we have even more folks who are using a variety of cloud-based API services to get access to large language models, either proprietary or open source from their cloud-based providers. And then we have a lot more folks who are looking to get generative AI as part of their embedded applications from their trusted application providers and not have to go out to the market and figure out their own models and build their own capabilities from scratch. But it's not just one or the other. Enterprises are typically taking a mix of all these different approaches. Now, how are we putting this to work in the enterprise? Well, when we look at how this is actually being applied and actually built out by creators and vendors in the space, it spans across the entire enterprise stack, all the way from embedded GenAI capabilities and applications, all the way down to the model offerings themselves, as well as the hardware and software or hardware environments that underlie this. Now, if we're thinking about this in an enterprise context, we need to think beyond just the model and how we're actually going to manage its behavior and help make it more focused on the types of outputs that we are interested in. So to do this, we need to manage inputs and outputs around the model. The inputs can be managed with things like model grounding, prompt engineering, and subject matter expertise, as well as single and few-shot learning. And then the output, the generation from the model, you can do things like check it for factual claims with another language model. You can review the language against your brand, style, and voice. You can keep a human in the loop for review as well, and then even use more natural language processing on the generated content to see if it aligns with particular business goals. And so these are all very important in terms of being able to focus the model on the behavior and output you want. Another approach that we're seeing very commonly today is retrieval augmented generation, where we use a combination of language models and vector embeddings with a vector database to retrieve information. And then we may actually use a different language model to put together the answer from the data coming from the vector database to serve that up to the end user. And this demonstrates how we're seeing an additional level of complexity in these implementations where there may be multiple models, including both proprietary and open source models in the implementation. Now, when we're talking about the next generation of enterprise implementations, these will get even more complex likely, involving a combination of multiple different models that are orchestrated either by a coordinator model like we have Llama listed in here, or by a more a rule-based coordination set. But ultimately, we'll likely see multiple different databases incorporated with specialized models applied to them in some cases, or simply vectorized or otherwise indexed for retrieval to send back to that central coordinator model. And so how are we going to do this? Well, we're having a lot of demands from the enterprise from end users for actually being able to test and validate these different models against each other. So there's a couple of different open source options that are emerging on the market today, as well as a plethora of vendor provided options for doing model orchestration and monitoring when they are in production. Now, one last thing before we get to, before I kind of close out this very fast overview of the current state of generative AI and some of the application approaches that you'll need to take, is this aspect of bring your own AI. So not only are we going to need to think about building applications and how those applications are going to affect our enterprise and how they're going to help us grow and generate more revenues and things of that nature, we also need to think about the aspect of AI that is going to be in the bring your own area. So BYOAI has really started to come to the fore in the past 13 months because of ChatGPT and similar tools, whereas where we have end users realizing that they have some task to accomplish and they don't have the enterprise tools to do so. We're seeing many folks go out there into the wild and basically use their own language model or whatever other AI service it is without any support or approval or authorization from their central organization. So even beyond the technical aspects and the kind of core team aspects, we also need to think about the broader implications of having these tools or not having them available within our enterprise. And there's some core extended elements of this that we won't go into too much, perhaps in the discussion. But I'll wrap it up right there. The generative AI landscape is very broad. There's a number of different approaches to acquiring these tools. And as you saw very quickly, there's different ways to actually shape the inputs and the outputs to focus the behavior of the models to reduce things like hallucinations and coherent nonsense and increase auditability. But there's still a lot of work to be done. It's a very, very exciting space. So thank you for the time, and I will pass it back over and excited for the follow-on discussion here.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for the insights, Rowan, and I loved BYOAI. Okay, that's an interesting term as well. Thank you very much. That sets the foundation for our next set of questions. So SRIRAM and SHASHANK, given what Rowan has said, how do you see AI, GenAI transforming the world of decision intelligence in organizations? SRIRAM, you want to go first?
Sure, Kishor. No, I think it was a very good sort of overview that we got from Rowan. And I think he touched upon quite a few aspects of how AI and GenAI is sort of fundamentally transforming decision intelligence. So we've been seeing through our work with our clients that AI is already embedded in most of enterprise applications, whether it be pricing, forecasting, marketing, recommendations. A lot of AI is incorporated at the core of what enterprises are doing. GenAI just brings in an additional dimension to it. It is allowing employees, it's allowing end customers to be able to interact with data, models, outputs in a language that they are most comfortable and familiar with, which is English or natural language, right? So we are seeing a huge wave of how do we enable employees and consumers, give better experience to them, and enable better decision intelligence through GenAI, right? Where core of that AI has already been broadly embedded in enterprises over the last several years, right? So that's the broad trend that at least I'm seeing through all interactions with our clients.
So you're saying that AI was embedded, but now you have GenAI that makes it more usable, consumable, and
exactly more usable, more consumable, allows users to interact with the data and the insights, and doesn't need as much of a technical expertise to be able to interface with it.
Awesome. Shashank, what do you think?
Thanks for the question, Kishor and Rowan. Great presentation. So I think, so like Rowan rightly pointed out, and as SRIRAM spoke about it as well, I think AI has been around for a while. So, the paradigm of AI has usually been smarter, quicker, more timely decisions, right? I think the big shift, as SRIRAM talked about, is the manner of adoption, which in my mind has kind of shifted the paradigm quite a bit. Not only has it created a lot of buzz, so for the first time, I think there is a huge leap in the democratization of AI, right? While it was in the hands of a few technical people in the past, now it's so much more democratized because even a very well done generative AI application can be used very well by laymen to answer some complex questions. So that plus, obviously there's a reduction in training, there's a lower barrier of usage that kind of contributes to true democratization of AI. So we're living in exciting times for sure.
That sounds great. But what are some of the use cases that you're seeing, right? And are some of the industries more ahead than the others? What are your thoughts there, SRIRAM?
Yeah, no, I think from an industry perspective, we're by and large seeing most industries, like Rowan was pointing out, experimenting, trying out, figuring out use cases, implementing some of the use cases. But we see two broad dimensions to the use cases. One is around productivity or employee experience, right? So how can employees in organizations leverage this technology, use this technology to be more productive, spend time on insights and outputs rather than generating them. So to give you an example, we've been working with fairly large pharmaceutical companies where they spend a lot of time going through research reports, reports about drugs, which could be leveraged across markets, right? So if you have something launched in US, what could be the implication of that if you were to launch it in some European market, right? So finding that information, synthesizing that information, a lot of that used to be quite a bit of research activity and work across various documents and doing analysis in that. Now with generative AI, a lot of that is becoming much more seamless for employees, right? So it's kind of leading to productivity boost. The other types of applications we see are more in the end consumer experience enablement. To give you an example, e-commerce search. We're seeing a lot of organizations fundamentally think about e-commerce search a bit differently. How can that be more conversational? How can we have more knowledge and language understanding be part of the search process itself, right? So a lot of exciting use cases, but I would broadly say productivity and customer experience, right? To the two aspects that are predominantly behind these use cases.
So you're saying that essentially it's prevalent across industries, it cuts across industries, and it's broadly across these two dimensions.
Broadly across these two dimensions, and across most industries, we are seeing experiments and employees wanting to and implementing use cases with GenAI.
Fantastic. And Shashank, what about Mars? What do you see there? What is happening?
Yeah, I think to Sriram's point, I think it broadly kind of follows that trend, right? So essentially, if you look from an industry perspective, high tech, retail, banking have always been ahead of the curve when it comes to AI adoption and implementation. And I think it's no different with, generative AI. Now, in Mars, we typically follow like a 4Cs, what we call a 4Cs framework, right? So there's content synthesis, creative content, coding, and then customer engagement. So while generative AI has tangible impact across all domains, I think the highest impact we are probably seeing is in the sales and marketing area, right? So you have, for example, at scale personalized marketing content, I think is one, right? Maybe, a Gen AI driven rapid concept development for innovation, for the innovation side of things, or, knowledge management for more internal facing use cases for HR or IT. So these are some of the use cases we are seeing. One good example would probably also be the work, Tiger Analytics is doing with us on the global media dashboard, which focus on adoption and implementation. So what we are seeing currently in Mars is, while there's a lot of excitement for a lot of these areas, external facing areas, we are making true improvements, mostly in the internal facing areas or internal facing applications. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Shashank. And Rowan, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah,
Rowan,
so yep. So I think those are a great set of examples, and I totally agree with everything that's been said, particularly with everybody mentioning that this is a very cross-industry story. So I very oftentimes get asked, what is industry has, the most potential use cases here? Well, it's pretty much every industry, because many of the use cases are so industry agnostic. So to kind of build off the taxonomy that I was talking about before, and building off of what both SRIRAM and SHASHANK were saying, one of the biggest set of use cases that I'm seeing is around that employee productivity and knowledge support. So that is comes in kind of two different flavors. It's either allowing an employee to be more productive in their writing, content creation, things of that nature. So going along with like the personalized marketing content generation and things like that, both at a personal level and at scale. But then also in terms of being able to access information and get to knowledge faster. So using things like retrieval augmented generation, or getting into kind of some of those knowledge retrieval use cases. Now, one of the biggest set of use cases that we saw over the course of 2023, and I think we'll see even more into 2024, is use cases in the customer service and support area. And this isn't necessarily a set of use cases that are customer facing per se. It's really using language models to further enhance the agent's capabilities, or in the information collected from that customer interaction, to drive better insights down the line. So we have folks in the telecom industry who are creating large language model driven summarizations of their call center transcripts. Instead of having the agents write them from scratch, the agents will still approve them and read them, but they don't have to write them from scratch, saving a bit of time. And then additionally, some of these folks are actually using the language models to extract some information from the transcripts themselves that will help drive downstream analytics. So extracting some metadata, whether it be topics, entities, things of that nature, so that the data is already enriched whenever they're doing their more traditional types of text analytics. And I think that's a really good example of how you can have these kind of operational supports as well as the more strategic supports within the organization. And I just wanted to kind of quickly touch on one other use case that we've been seeing, and that's in the code generation and the Turing bot side. So a lot of the attention has been around, how do we use these things to, build more interesting applications faster, to iterate through things more quickly. But one of the interesting use cases that I've seen that comes from AT&T is they've been using large language models and Turing bots to basically help them migrate legacy telecom code to more modern software architectures, not only so that it's more secure, but also so that they can create more interesting services on top of them because they're easier to interact with third-party systems. And they're using large language models to help create those the drafts of that converted code that would take human developers much longer to develop from scratch. You still have human developers in the loop, but they are accelerating the process very significantly.
Fascinating. Now, there's a lot of skepticism though around this whole thing about AI and GenAI also, right? So are these just pilots, or is anything even being put in production? Or what do you see as patterns of adoption of these solutions? Are we talking 1 year, 3 years, 5 years? What exactly is this? So Rowan, any thoughts there?
Yeah, so I mean, we are certainly seeing tons and tons and tons and tons of pilots. I think that, nobody is in any, denial of that, but it's not just pilots that we are seeing. Some of the examples that I mentioned before are in, scaled production. Some of the telecom folks are processing, tens of thousands of call center transcripts a day with these types of applications. So it certainly is being deployed at scale today, though, I think that we are seeing more pilots than scaled productions at this moment, but that partially has to do with the amount of time that we've had to actually roll these things out. I will also say that, what I am seeing is more in production applications that tend to be focused on the productivity and knowledge retrieval side, and more pilots that are on the kind of customer facing types of use case side. And maybe not pilots, maybe they're in beta, but overall, I've seen more of the internal use cases be farther along. Now, when we look kind of ahead, I think what is very interesting here is that in this past year, we've really only seen the first generation of these applications where everybody has said, oh, we can use a large language model or a diffusion model to do X, Y, Z. And so we've had, kind of an explosion of these, what I would call almost baseline capabilities, using it for the knowledge support and whatnot. And as everybody adopts this stuff, we're entering a world where essentially, everybody has a superpower. And so in a world where everybody has a superpower, what does it actually mean to be a superhero? How do you differentiate when everybody has these very powerful tools? So I think it's going to be very fascinating and delightful to see what types of applications people start to build once we really have a set of best practices and known approaches for these initial range of enterprise applications that we're building with these things now.
Awesome. So SRIRAM, are you seeing any superheroes? What do you think?
No, I think Rowan covered quite a few of those sort of use cases that we are also seeing getting productionized, right? So there's clearly a trend towards sort of taking some of the pilots to production. A lot of those are generally focused on internal productivity type use cases. And there's also a pattern here wherein, given the nature of the technology and how just nascent is it, right? It's just been about a year or so since ChatGPT was released, that there is very extensive user testing. Right? So we are seeing a lot of beta releases, a lot of internal users being onboarded to test. So to give you an example, we've been working with a very large call center agency, and we've built out agent productivity solutions with GenAI. And based on some of the promising results that they saw in the pilot, they have been working on fairly extensive user testing, where the GenAI based, almost like an assistant for the call center agent is enabled. There's a lot of user feedback, not just on the accuracy, but also on the quality, the latency, and various other dimensions of the model and the output. And it's sort of being used to build more user confidence, right? And a lot of organizations we are seeing are in that journey right now, getting to production, but going through a fairly elaborate, extensive user testing phase, right? So more and more pilots are entering is what we see.
Fantastic. Shashank?
Yeah, I think, pretty much Rowan and SRIRAM covered it. I think Mars is not very different from what trend we're noticing across the industry. So we have an extensive number of pilots running. There's a lot of buzz and excitement around generative AI. Now, for this kind of gave us the impetus to launch like an AI lab. So what we call the AI Learning and Innovation Lab as a part of our Newark facility. So, and Tiger is one of our partners over there. But essentially, this helps us kind of experiment, explore with new technologies, demystify them for the organization, and also possibly give some hands-on experience to a lot of the general associates within the facility of how GenAI works. In this case, particularly GenAI, how it works and how it can kind of impact different areas. So there's definitely been a mindset shift, a noticeable mindset shift towards AI. Now, when we talk about adopting it or what it looks like for 1, 3, 5 years, I think essentially we are yet to, everyone's focused on the most basic use cases, right? Like that come to mind right away. A lot of it is obviously productivity based. Essentially, I think one of the challenges we're facing is an education aspect, which again goes back to the AI lab, which is what makes a good Gen AI use case versus a classical AI use case. So that's some of the things that we are focusing on within the organization. Now, when you talk about future trends, I think it's difficult to talk about what 3 years or 5 years looks like sitting here. But I think essentially we would look at a culmination of different technologies, right? Like very much like example Uber did in the previous generation. We are kind of looking forward to what an app that can amalgamate a lot of the existing technologies and just missing maybe a piece of the puzzle like generative AI that can now foster a whole new generation of applications. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Shashank. And the other thing I've been working with Mars closely. Seeing your innovation lab has been, it's been a great opportunity to work and partner with you in the innovation lab. And that seems to have been a big impetus to drive adoption as well, right? And executive commitment.
Absolutely. So now the innovation lab, I think, gave a very good reason for a lot of our high level officers and our senior team members to kind of use this as a good forum to educate the general public, but also bring in a culture of technical learning, a culture that promotes hacking, a culture that also promotes learning new things and implementing them, right? And a lot of this has now been facilitated by our senior leaders. So essentially, we kicked this off in November last year, and so far it's been doing great. We are able to run several programs through it, especially educational programs and training programs that along with a lot of the experiments that I talked about, run under the forum of the lab itself. So it has been able to funnel a lot of the general excitement we see within the org, and be able to kind of channelize that to leverage to create new experiments or learn new experiments or learn new things.
So getting a little more technical, Shashank, what are some of the technical patterns you're seeing in your implementations? Right.
So I think the best way to think about this is in terms of some sort of framework. So essentially, in Mars, we look at it from an emerge, establish, scale kind of framework, right? So now, for example, for application of Gen AI, so you have one in the emerge area, you will have acceleration of key processes, improvements, and single step tasks. In the establish, you'll have augmentation of entire functions by supporting low value tasks, done by most employees. And then automation, you have, at scale, platform dependent or platform run kind of utilizations. Now, in March specifically, we are seeing a mixture of, the emerge and establish. We are trying to move towards the scale, but the scale is typically more disruptive and is also high risk, right? So the idea is to, it also comes down to different functions. So for example, if we're talking about, knowledge management, it's typically a low risk if we were to do it within, let's say, an HR, or it may become higher risk if we were to do it within legal. But essentially, we are focusing more on the emerge and establish right now. So I think in terms of frameworks, that would be the best way. Now, also, we'll have to look at, cost as a big factor as you kind of go through this, because experiments don't typically give you a good understanding of cost. As we go towards scale, cost is becoming a big factor, which requires LLM ops and with the kind of efficiencies that can bring to the table.
And what about data?
Right. So, yeah, I think one of the bigger things this has uncovered is, the importance of the quality of data. So now, while GenAI is extremely exciting, I think it can only reach its true potential when, we have good quality data available. And for that, you need, obviously, as all of us know on the call, it requires a certain level of maturity for the org. So we have embarked on this journey of creating a connected data foundation, again, partnership with Tiger here, where the idea is to kind of be able to stitch a huge number of data sources and data sets together in a manner that will allow us to then utilize the data for several applications, GenAI being one of them. Now, this is obviously a multi-year journey that propels us in terms of maturity, data maturity. So there are a lot of elements to it, but we have been making good progress so far.
Fantastic. In fact, I just second that thing on establishing a proper data foundation and data strategy. Over the last few months, we have started multiple across industries now exercises of getting back to basics of data strategy, saying how are you going to deal with the data so that organizations can leverage the data effectively for AI, right? Thanks for that, Shashank. Rowan, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just want to initially echo what you both were saying around the importance of the underlying data being a key contributor to actually producing really interesting and differentiated capabilities with AI applications. So the folks that we've seen able to move to production with generative AI applications in 2023 were generally the folks who had a very strong data and machine learning practice that was underlying their overall organization. So, they were prepared to actually reference the correct information to build, very quality applications. And on that note, one of the most common patterns that I'm seeing in terms of technical architectures for generative AI applications today is retrieval augmented generation, which I'm guessing many of our listeners have heard of. And if you haven't, essentially it's the architecture that I showed in my slide presentation, where you have a query that comes in, you at the very basic level extract content that you have put into a vector database, you give it back to the model, and then it synthesizes an answer for you. And one of the reasons that we're seeing this emerge as one of the key architectures, or key architectural approaches, I would say almost a best practice at this point in time, is because it's a very good way of grounding the model around a specific set of data so that it doesn't generate as many hallucinations, and so that you can control that coherent nonsense that it's generating in various ways. You can use, further focusing of the prompts by using prompt engineering. You can use approaches to analyze the output, as I was referencing in my presentation as well, to do things like create citations around the content that is actually being referenced in the generated answer. So to greater or lesser degrees, whoever's using that information is able to trace it back to the information source. And so that's really one of the main approaches that we're seeing to these applications. And there's various different flavors of that and different approaches. There's all kinds of different stuff that folks are starting to do in terms of actually creating the prompt itself by enriching it with information coming from, say, a predictive model. So you have a customer that comes into the website. You might use your segmentation model to identify what segment that customer falls into, pass that segment as a piece of information as you're in the query to the large language model, which then helps further ground the behavior. So even when we're kind of in this retrieval augmented generation approach, we can see how predictive AI and generative AI can kind of come together to build the full end-to-end application. Now, one of the other aspects kind of on the user side that I'll quickly touch on is the need and demand for simulation and testing tools when using these models. So one of the big challenges that folks are trying to overcome is how do we actually deal with the extreme variety of large language models, for one, and then all the other generative models that exist out there in the world and how to assess them against each other. So we're seeing various different types of studios, libraries, orchestration tools for large language models to understand how they behave. And this is a bit distinct from the LLM ops, which I think we'll talk about a bit later on, but it's also distinct because at this point we're talking about the creation and let's say, application training stage of the model, not the actual model in production.
Awesome. SRIRAM?
No, I think both Shashank and Rowan have covered a lot of key aspects in terms of patterns that we are seeing, right? So whether it's around data quality, the RAG approach, as well as enabling traceability and auditability. What we see is prompting is obviously underneath all the patterns that we see, whether it's through copilots that are integrated with enterprise software, whether it is with the RAG approach, or we're also seeing fair degree of fine-tuning, right? In industries where there are specific nuances to their data, to the way the language needs to be rendered. Like, for example, we're working on generating clinical trial reports. So fair degree of fine-tuning based approaches are also being come across various industries. And then all of this is getting wrapped in some sort of an application, right? So at the end of the day, GenAI is being wrapped as an application for enterprises. So there is an whole application part to the patterns that we see. And behind the scenes, it could be a copilot, it could be a retrieval augmented generation, it could be fine-tuning, or it could be some combination of all of these. And that's the way it is evolving. Still a lot of things to be figured out as newer models, newer patterns are emerging. And to Rowan's point earlier, there are newer orchestration tools, newer ways the entire solution is getting stitched together. But these are some common themes we see today across most of our implementations.
And SRIRAM, what do you see around the patterns of productionalizing these models?
Yeah, so from a productionizing, right? So it's kind of similar to what you would see with typical machine learning. There are some components which are a bit different. One part is really the whole ops lifecycle, right? So it's still a subset of ML ops, but there are a few dimensions which we see are slightly different. One is the whole idea of human feedback collection, and that is a very critical part to the entire GenAI landscape, right? So how do we tool the entire solution, productionize it so that human feedback collection is enabled at scale, right? So that's one aspect. Then there is an aspect around enabling the compute that is needed for both training and inferencing of these models, right? So how do we manage GPUs? How do we sort of provision these GPUs? What kind of services do we need to bring together to be able to do this? And then the rest of the pieces, like I said, is similar to what you would see in enterprise ML ops, right? So it's kind of a subset, and there's a cost optimization component that's increasingly becoming important because enterprises are realizing that they're sort of bringing through a lot of new technology. There is obviously a cost consideration here. So how do we sort of optimize for that cost is a layer that is sort of increasingly becoming important as more and more use cases get productionized.
Rowan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add on that I think, so I'll just add on to say that when we are thinking as practitioners about this type of stuff, I think it's very important to remember that though there are special considerations for LLM ops that exist at the kind of technical level, especially when we start to talk about, the underlying physical hardware, when we're interacting with business users or, even with less technical colleagues, I think it's important to not go too far down the rabbit hole of separating out LLM ops as a completely different discipline. We are all still learning about this and developing best practices, and I think it certainly makes sense to conceptually separate it right now and develop it as a separate discipline. But we've all been through various cycles of generating more and more different types of ops, whether it's DevOps or SecDevOps or ML ops to model ops and all this different types of stuff. We obviously need these things, data ops, but there is also the danger of having too many of these specific types of ops when really some of them should all kind of fall under the same umbrella ultimately when we're talking about the outcomes. So I think the points are spot on, but as well when we're talking about kind of less technically sophisticated users, they don't care about what the underlying infrastructure is. They just care about the whole array of models and how they're performing the application for the business.
Absolutely. Shashank, any thoughts?
Yeah, I fully in agreement with what Sriram and Rowan said. So even in Mars, we are now treating LLM ops as a part of ML ops. So essentially, while there are slightly different considerations, but in general, it follows, I think, similar operational guidelines as, be it model ops, test ops, so on and so forth. Now, I think one changing pattern would probably be the advent of like a platform approach to this, right? So that's I think one thing that we have seen where there's more of a broad platform that can provide generative AI capabilities through the entire life cycle of like some user journeys, right? So I think that's where we are currently headed as a company, but it's slow and steady progress. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that leads to, we've talked about technology, we've talked about the use cases. What are some of the other design considerations, right, that need to be taken into account in order to establish these capabilities? Shashank, any thoughts on what you're doing there at Mars?
Yeah, essentially, we are very big on responsible AI or ethical AI. Now, everything we do, especially with, any new technologies, it's through the lens of responsible AI. Now, there is not much of a guidance from the government. I know a few bills have recently passed, but in general, what we are looking at is, to kind of mitigate any concerns when it comes to privacy, when it comes to security or any of the biases, right? Which I think is applicable to any AI model. But with generative AI, I think it becomes that much more important just because of the democratization aspect that we spoke about earlier. Now, while we have our own set of standards and own set of principles that we follow in terms of responsible AI, I'm hoping that soon we will see like a more cohesive regulatory approach to generative AI.
Fantastic. And Rowan, what are you seeing in your work through research?
Yeah, so we're seeing a couple of different elements. So on the people side, we have a framework that we call the robotics quotient, which essentially is a measure of how ready teams are to work with various AI systems. And it essentially boils down to, how comfortable they are working with, both predictive systems, but also systems that may take over, part of their job. And not every organization is at the same place here. And so it's important to understand kind of how ready your employees are to actually use these tools. And then building on that, as we've started to see the large-scale rollouts of some of these employee productivity and support tools, rather than just kind of at the smaller individual level, we're seeing that folks need perhaps more guidance than we initially thought in terms of how to use these things. So building into your UI good quality guidance of how to actually leverage the tool is very important. And I think that goes back to a point that was mentioned earlier. Sorry, I can't, SRIRAM or SHASHANK, I can't remember which of you said it, about the need to build in feedback loops into your applications to be able to capture user feedback on how the application is performing. I think all of that is very important. And then additionally, on that same point of the larger organization, many of these, especially the research tools and the productivity tools have been used more at the individual or team level and not so much at the departmental or enterprise level. And so when we get to that larger level, then there's perhaps some interesting implications about how we organize, how we work together, and how we collaborate that may have not been possible in the past, though I can't speculate on what those things necessarily might be because they haven't quite emerged yet. But then on top of it, I think, there's this increased need to provide transparency that was alluded to before. And with language models, as well as predictive models overall, it's important to be able to provide people with reasons that a decision is being made. And with many traditional machine learning models, you can kind of give an explanation for that, whether it's technical or a bit more business oriented. But with these flavors of deep learning and transformer models, it is very challenging or impossible to provide an explanation about specifically what piece of data or information drove a certain generation, unless you're grounding it with retrieval augmented generation. So that's a different type of consideration in the design and the use of these tools than we may have had in the past. And then one other piece around the design considerations, I think it's important for folks to remember when they're looking at the open source landscape of generative models that open source does not always mean open source when it comes to generative AI. There's various different gradations of licenses that are associated with the open source models. And so if you're an organization that's thinking about building with your with a model behind your firewall, it's really important to understand what the details of the licensing behind that open source model are, and not just in terms of how you can use it, but what degree of transparency there is into the model itself, whether it be having access to the parameters or having access to the underlying data set. There's different degrees of insight that you are provided when it comes to this, and that can have a big impact on what models your organization feels comfortable with using in various circumstances.
Fantastic. And one thing that you mentioned there was very interesting. It caught my attention, the word collaboration. The reason is we are also seeing a trend with some of the leading organizations looking at a rethink of their processes, a complete transformation of their process, rethinking finance, rethinking HR, rethinking supply chain, because historically they always looked at these in terms of package implementation, but now they're looking at it as a data-driven transformation. And therefore, that brings a huge opportunity across all of these process areas. And that's where we're seeing them taking a step back to rethink the processes. So thanks for bringing that up. And collaboration becomes a significant element of how you collaborate on insights and then make decisions and then take actions based on that. Thank you very much, Rowan. So SRIRAM, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think all three of you touched upon some other key design considerations, right? Whether it's responsible AI, process transformation, some of the pieces around collaboration and elements that Rowan talked about. I think we are also seeing a lot of these as we have been working with our clients. A couple other aspects I'll just highlight. One is around success criteria, right? How do we measure success for a generative AI-based application or a solution, or what generative AI is enabling organizations to do? And it's not as clean or clear as typical AI-based solutions. Right? It's not just about accuracy or business value alone, but also how do we bring in appropriateness of language, right? Alignment with the right kind of messaging, the right kind of branding, content that organizations want to put out, what kind of ethical and other guardrails do we put in? And sort of quite a bit of work we are seeing evolving in various spaces, primarily in a bit more regulated industries and applications where we need to bring in some of these guardrails. We need to make sure that it is adhering to organizations' requirements around privacy, security. So those considerations, I would say, Kishor, are sort of also very central to as organizations move from a pilot to something which is more consumer facing, right? And that's a pattern increasingly that we are seeing.
Awesome. So we have some questions coming in from the audience, so I'll take some of those. One is, this is to Shashank and SRIRAM. How are you preparing the talent to work on these new capabilities? How do you manage to develop required skills? So Shashank, maybe from a Mars and a customer perspective, and then we'll take SRIRAM from a service provider perspective. Shashank?
Absolutely. Thanks. I think that's a very interesting question. So essentially, since this is such an evolving landscape, I think it's really important to kind of focus on some basic elements that don't really change, across technologies, right? I think, for example, an intersection of math, business, and technology is something that's always going to be relevant in the AI or data science world. Now, essentially, while recruiting, we focus a little more heavily on the ability to understand and break down a problem into its components. So a very generic way of solving a problem, which is pretty applicable, across technologies. And, in terms of grooming internal talent, this is where, it's really important, since it's an evolving landscape again, to kind of leverage like the startup ecosystem, and then leverage our partner ecosystem. So for example, we are leveraging Tiger here in terms of trainings and keeping us abreast of what's happening in terms of latest technologies.
And SRIRAM?
So I think from our perspective, more from a service provider standpoint, we are kind of delivering solutions, enabling some of this for our clients. So typically, when you look at talent, especially technical talent, as across the entire AI spectrum, you could sort of break it down into data scientists, machine learning engineers, data engineers, BI developers. But GenAI is sort of cutting across all of these, right? So there's an engineering component, there is a dashboarding, application development component, there's a machine learning component, there's backend development, and also understanding of the business context, being able to interpret the generated output, not just the code. So we see it as much more integrated. And as a result, we've sort of thought about it as more like an integrated team and a series of sort of trainings across the various disciplines, whether it's engineering, large language models, as well as on the application side. And to enable that, we've set up a R&D and a GenAI lab and sort of associated training. And that's how it's sort of been working for us. And we've seen clearly that having more of an end-to-end perspective, end-to-end view across the entire team, and training folks at least to sort of look at it more end-to-end is what is really helping them deliver this to clients, right? So rather than looking at it as individual skills or very, very focused on specific aspects of GenAI, right? So that's kind of how things have been evolving for us.
Awesome. Then probably one last question I'll take. This is, what do you advise clients who are looking to embark on this journey of transforming decision intelligence using AI and GenAI? Shashank, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the most important thing is going to be, at least the way we're looking at it in Mars, is to create a structure, an operational construct that can absorb the variability that comes with this evolving landscape, right? So I think that's going to be critical, because it's going to be difficult to shift strategy or operational constraints every time there's a new development. So I think that's going to be probably the most important thing for us as we kind of dive into this. Obviously, other than making sure that we have the right talent, making sure that we are pursuing the right use cases and getting the organization ready in terms of adoption and implementation.
SRIRAM?
Yeah, so I think organizations that are looking to embark, right? My suggestion would be maybe a two-pronged approach, wherein one part of it is these organizations have to do a lot of experiments, right? So you have to experiment with several models, experiments with different types of use cases. So how do you sort of build that understanding of where it's working given your context, right? So do lots of experiments. So that's one part. But as you're doing that, how do we also have a strategy around GenAI? This is a very rapidly evolving field. Newer models that are emerging, newer applications that are emerging. Some of these capabilities are getting embedded in enterprise software. So what should you be doing? Should you be buying something? Should you be building something? How fast should you go? Should you really wait and watch for how it evolves over a period of time, right? Having a thoughtful approach, having a strategy around what should you be doing is also a parallel thing, because eventually you'll need to start figuring out as an organization, after the initial pilots, where do we go from here, right? So kind of having both would be what I would suggest if anybody is looking to get started with GenAI sort of roadmap right now.
So in short, irrespective of the industry, irrespective of the function, no choice to start thinking about it. Rowan?
Yeah, so I think what was mentioned is really great so far. And to just add on to that, I think the data preparation piece is very important, and not just in terms of making sure you have the available data, but understanding what types of data you might need to drive your application. And that's going to tie into the architecture thoughts that you need to think about with this. But certainly kind of having that very adaptive approach, because it may be that you start with an approach that is primarily oriented towards using something like retrieval augmented generation, but that ends up not working, and you need to shift to an approach that maybe uses more fine tuning as its core function. So I think that's an important part. And then also the need to identify use cases that are core or peripheral. So we've seen a lot of folks wanting to build what amounts to, in the old days, it would be like building a word processor for your organization, which you would never do, from the late 90s onwards. That's basically what some of these applications amount to that people are trying to build. So look to your third-party providers and partners that are incorporating generative AI capabilities that can supplement what you're doing internally, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And of course, I think, move quickly on this and be prepared to iterate quickly, and also don't neglect predictive AI as well.
And a lot of insights, but Rowan, what you said last, it's really move quickly, iterate quickly, and there's no industry, as SRIRAM mentioned, no industry, no organization that can be left behind, it can afford to be left behind. So look forward to working with all of you in 2024 on this exciting journey, and hopefully 2024 has a lot of great stuff in store for us. Thank you very much. Thanks again, and have a great year.